I came home from work on a Tuesday afternoon to find 3 HOA board members digging up my parkway and installing a flower bed I never authorized. The woman in charge, standing there with a clipboard and a bright yellow vest that seemed 2 sizes too small, introduced herself as Patricia Hensley, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association in suburban Phoenix, Arizona. I'd lived at 2847 Saguaro Drive for 8 months, and this was the first time I'd actually seen any HOA board member in person, though I'd received plenty of their passive-aggressive letters about my grass being a 1/4 inch too tall. "What exactly are you doing to my property?" I asked, setting down my work bag on the driveway. The summer heat was oppressive, even at 5 in the evening, and sweat was already forming on my forehead. Patricia looked up from her clipboard with the kind of smile that suggested she was doing me an enormous favor. "Mr. Ferguson, we're beautifying the neighborhood. The board voted last month to install coordinated flower beds on all parkways along Saguaro Drive. Didn't you receive the newsletter?" "I receive a lot of things from the HOA," I said, watching 2 men in their 50s carefully arranging decorative stones around what used to be grass. "But I don't remember anything about voting for this." "The board voted," Patricia said, emphasizing the word board. "Homeowner approval isn't required for common area improvements." "This isn't a common area," I pointed out. "This is my parkway. It's part of my property." Patricia's smile tightened. She was probably in her early 50s, with short blonde hair styled in that particular way that screamed HOA president. Her HOA vest was adorned with several pins that said things like community pride and neighborhood excellence. "Actually, according to the CC and Articus, the HOA has purview over all visible landscaping, including parkways, to maintain neighborhood standards. We're planting drought-resistant perennials, which will look lovely and comply with the new Arizona water conservation guidelines." I stood there watching them work, feeling my blood pressure rise. The parkway, that strip of land between the sidewalk and the street, had been plain grass when I moved in. Not beautiful, not terrible, just grass. Now they were installing raised wooden borders, filling it with soil, and preparing to plant flowers I hadn't chosen and didn't particularly want. "How much is this costing?" I asked. The assessment was included in last quarter's special fees. Each homeowner on Saguaro Drive is paying $250 for materials and installation. $250. I felt my jaw clench. I didn't agree to this. "Again, Mr. Ferguson, board approval is sufficient for neighborhood improvements." "Now, if you'll excuse me, we need to finish before dark. We have 11 more houses to complete this week." I wanted to argue more, but the workers were already planting purple and yellow flowers whose names I didn't know and didn't care to learn. Instead, I grabbed my bag and went inside, immediately pulling up the HOA documents I'd signed when I bought the house. My name is Thomas Ferguson, and I'm a network engineer for a tech company downtown. I'm 32 years old, single, and I'd bought this house thinking it would be a good investment in a decent neighborhood. The HOA had seemed like a minor annoyance at worst. I was quickly learning that assumption had been wildly optimistic. I spent 2 hours that evening reading through the CC and Articus, those covenants, conditions, and restrictions that govern HOA communities. The language was dense and clearly written by lawyers who enjoyed making simple things complicated. There were sections about architectural standards, landscaping requirements, and aesthetic guidelines. But nowhere did I find anything that explicitly gave the HOA the right to install improvements on individual property without consent, especially not on parkways that were technically part of each homeowner's lot. The next morning, I called a real estate attorney named David Morrison, whose office was in Scottsdale. His paralegal scheduled me for a consultation that Thursday. When Thursday came, I took a half-day off work and drove to Morrison's office with photos of my Parkway and copies of all the HOA documents. His office was in a modern building with glass walls and expensive-looking furniture in the waiting room. Morrison was a tall man in his 40s with graying hair and the kind of calm demeanor that probably served him well in negotiations. He listened to my story, looked through the documents, and finally leaned back in his leather chair. "Mr. Ferguson, the short answer is that they're probably overstepping their authority," he said. "The Parkway is part of your property lot. While the HOA does have broad powers to enforce aesthetic standards, they can't typically force installations on private property without consent. They can tell you what you can't do within reason, but they can't make you install something specific. So what are my options? You could sue the HOA, but that's expensive and time-consuming. You could file a complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate, which oversees HOAs. Or you could simply remove what they installed and restore it to its previous condition. Technically, they've trespassed and altered your property without permission. If I remove it, what happens? They'll probably fine you for violating their landscaping standards. You'll dispute the fine. It could escalate, but you'd have a strong legal position that they were the ones who acted improperly first." He paused. "My advice: remove it, send them a certified letter explaining why, and cite the relevant property laws. If they want to fight about it, you'll win, but it'll be annoying." "How annoying?" "Depends how stubborn your HOA board is. In my experience, very stubborn." I left his office with a strategy and a determination not to let Patricia Hensley and her board walk all over me. That evening, I stopped at a home improvement store and bought a small rototiller, 5 bags of clover seed, and some soil amendments. Saturday morning came with typical Phoenix sunshine and temperatures already climbing into the 90s by 8. I wheeled my new rototiller out to the Parkway and started it up. The noise was loud enough to wake several neighbors, and I saw curtains moving in windows up and down the street. The flower bed came apart easily. The plants had only been in the ground for a few days and hadn't established roots. I pulled them out, stacked them neatly on the sidewalk, and started tilling the soil. The rototiller chewed through the carefully arranged dirt, mixing it with the clay underneath. It took about an hour to completely destroy their work. I was spreading clover seed when Patricia's silver Mercedes SUV pulled up to the curb. She got out wearing white capri pants and a pink blouse, looking like she was on her way to brunch at the country club. Her face was already red, and not from the heat. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, marching across my lawn. "Landscaping my Parkway," I said, continuing to spread seed. "With clover. It's drought-resistant, stays green all year, requires minimal mowing, and looks great. You destroyed the flower bed. You installed something on my property without my permission." "I'm correcting that mistake." Patricia's hands went to her hips. "The board approved this project. You're in violation of the landscaping standards, and I'm issuing you a fine right now." "You're welcome to try," I said, "but you should know I consulted with a real estate attorney. You don't have the legal right to force installations on my private property. The Parkway is part of my lot, not common area. You trespassed and made alterations without consent. The CC and Articus clearly state that all visible landscaping must maintain neighborhood standards. They do. And Clover maintains neighborhood standards just fine. It's green, it's neat, and it's actually better for the environment than grass. Unless you can show me where the CC and Articus specifically prohibit clover, which they don't, you don't have a leg to stand on." Patricia pulled out her phone. We'll see about that. You're going to be hearing from the board's attorney. Great, I said. My attorney loves hearing from HOA lawyers. It's very profitable for him. She got back in her Mercedes and drove off, tires squealing slightly. I finished spreading the clover seed, watered it thoroughly, and went inside feeling pretty satisfied with myself. The fine notice arrived in my mailbox on Monday. $500 for unauthorized landscape modifications and destruction of HOA-approved improvements. I filed it in a folder. I was starting to call my HOA battle file. On Tuesday, I drafted a response letter citing Arizona property law, explaining that the HOA had no authority to install improvements on my private property without permission, and noting that Clover was an appropriate landscape choice that met all stated standards in the CC and Articles. I sent it certified mail and emailed a copy to the HOA's general inbox. Wednesday brought no response. Thursday brought another fine notice, this one for $1,000, claiming I was in continued violation of the landscaping standards. Friday brought a third notice threatening legal action. By this point, the clover was starting to sprout. Little green shoots were pushing up through the soil, and it looked promising. Several neighbors stopped by to ask about it. Most were curious. A few were supportive, and one elderly woman named Margaret told me she thought the HOA had gotten too big for their britches, and she was glad someone was standing up to them. The following Tuesday, I received a packet from the HOA attorney, a law firm called Henderson and Associates. It was full of legal language threatening to place a lien on my property if I didn't pay the fines and restore the flower bed. I forwarded everything to David Morrison. He called me that afternoon. "This is pretty aggressive. They're trying to intimidate you. Don't pay anything yet. I'm going to send them a response explaining why their position is legally questionable. This might get interesting." How interesting? Court interesting, possibly. But probably not. Most HOAs back down when they realize they're going to spend thousands in legal fees defending a bad position. The board is likely getting free initial advice from their attorney, but once they have to start paying hourly rates for actual litigation, they usually reconsider. That weekend, my clover was coming in nicely. It was about 2 inches tall, covering the Parkway in a blanket of vibrant green. It looked good, honestly better than the patchy grass that had been there before. Several neighbors complimented it during their evening walks. On Monday, Patricia showed up again, this time with another board member, a man named Robert Childers who looked like he was in his 60s and wore a polo shirt with the HOA logo embroidered on it. They stood on the sidewalk, not stepping onto my property, and Patricia called out to me while I was watering my front yard. "Mr. Ferguson, the board would like to speak with you about resolving this situation." I walked over, hose still in hand. "I'm listening." Robert spoke this time. His voice was gravelly, like he'd smoked for years. "Look, we don't want this to become a big legal battle. The board invested money in those flower beds and we need consistency along the street. What would it take to get you to reinstall the flowers?" "Nothing," I said, "because I'm not doing it." "You installed something on my property without permission. That's the beginning and end of the story." Patricia jumped in. "We have the authority under the CC and Articles to maintain landscaping standards. You have the authority to tell me I can't paint my house purple or let my yard turn into a jungle. You don't have the authority to force me to install specific landscaping features. There's a difference between regulation and compulsion." "The clover looks cheap," Patricia said. "It lowers property values." Actually, Clover is making a comeback as an environmentally friendly lawn alternative. It fixes nitrogen in the soil, requires less water, stays green year-round and provides habitat for pollinators. It's probably raising property values, if anything. Robert sighed. We could waive the fines if you reinstall the flowers. No. Then we'll have no choice but to proceed with legal action and place a lien on your property. Do what you need to do, I said. But you should know that my attorney thinks your position is weak, and if you lose, you'll be paying my legal fees on top of your own. The board might want to think about whether this is really a good use of homeowner money. They left looking frustrated. That evening, I got emails from 3 different neighbors asking what was happening. Word was spreading through the neighborhood that there was a dispute with the HOA, and people were taking sides. Some thought I was being difficult for no reason. Others, apparently fed up with the HOA's increasingly aggressive enforcement of petty rules, were quietly cheering me on. One neighbor, a guy named Kevin who lived 2 houses down, came over that weekend with a beer in hand. He was in his 40s, worked in construction, and had a friendly, no-nonsense attitude. "Hey man, I just want to say I think what you're doing is great," he said. "The HOA has been out of control for years. They fined my wife $200 last year because our mailbox had a small dent in it." A dent like that affects anyone's quality of life. "They seem to think they run the neighborhood like it's their personal kingdom," I said. "They do, Patricia especially. She's been HOA president for 7 years now. Nobody ever runs against her because it's a volunteer position and who wants that headache. So she just gets re-elected every year and does whatever she wants. There has to be a way to check the board's power. In theory, homeowners can vote out the board or change the rules. In practice, nobody comes to meetings except the same 5 people who are already on the board's side. They hold meetings at weird times, like Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon when everyone's at work. It's a rigged system." This got me thinking. If the HOA was going to make this a fight, maybe it was time to fight back on multiple fronts. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Tuesday at 1:30 in the afternoon, according to the community website. I requested time off from work and showed up at the clubhouse, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that was used for community events. When I walked in, Patricia's expression suggested she just bit into a lemon. There were 5 board members sitting at a table at the front of the room, and about 8 other people scattered in chairs, mostly retirees who apparently had nothing better to do on a Tuesday afternoon. I signed in on the attendance sheet and took a seat. The meeting started with standard business: approval of last meeting's minutes, financial reports, discussion of the pool maintenance contract. It was boring enough to induce a coma. Finally, they got to new business. Patricia cleared her throat and looked directly at me. "We have an ongoing situation with a homeowner at 2847 Seguero Drive, who has destroyed HOA-approved landscaping and refuses to comply with board directives. The board has assessed fines totaling $1,500, and we're prepared to place a lien on the property if the homeowner doesn't come into compliance within 30 days. I raised my hand. "I'd like to address that." Patricia looked like she wanted to refuse, but Robert nodded. "You have 3 minutes. I stood up. "My name is Thomas Ferguson, and I'm the homeowner in question. The HOA installed a flower bed on my Parkway without my permission or consent. The Parkway is part of my private property, not common area. I have a legal opinion from a real estate attorney confirming that the HOA overstepped its authority. I removed the unauthorized installation and planted clover, which is an appropriate and environmentally friendly landscape choice that complies with all stated standards in our CC and Articus. The fines are unjustified, and any attempt to place a lien on my property will be challenged in court. An older man in the audience raised his hand. I'd like to hear more about this. Did the board really install something on private property without permission? Patricia's face was getting red. The board has authority under the CC and Articles to maintain neighborhood standards. We sent notice to all affected homeowners. Sending notice isn't the same as getting permission, I said. And you don't have the authority to force installations on private property. You can regulate, but you can't compel. A woman in her 70s spoke up. How much did this flower bed project cost? Robert consulted some papers. Total project cost was approximately $8,000 for 32 homes. And Mr. Ferguson's attorney says it was illegal. His attorney has a different interpretation of the CC and Articles, Patricia said quickly. But the board has consulted with our attorney, and we're confident in our position. Confident enough to risk tens of thousands in legal fees, I asked. Because that's where this is heading if you don't back down. The meeting devolved into argument. Some people defended the board, saying they were just trying to keep the neighborhood nice. Others questioned whether the board should be spending homeowner money on questionable projects and legal battles. Patricia finally called for order and moved on to other business, but the damage was done. People were asking questions. After the meeting, 3 homeowners approached me. One was Margaret, the elderly woman who'd supported me earlier. The others were a couple named Frank and Linda Chen who lived on the next street over. We've been frustrated with the HOA for a while, Linda said quietly. They've been making decisions without real homeowner input. We'd like to see some changes on the board. How would that happen? I asked. Frank explained. The next election is in November, 3 months away. 3 board seats are up for re-election. If we could get some reasonable people to run and actually get homeowners to vote, we could change the board's composition. Would any of you want to run? They looked at each other. We've thought about it, Margaret said, but we'd need support. The current board has all the communication channels. They control the newsletter, the website, everything. An idea was forming. What if we organized, started attending meetings, getting people engaged, finding candidates? That's a lot of work, Frank said. But if you're willing to help, we might be able to pull it off. We exchanged contact information and agreed to meet the following weekend to discuss strategy. In the meantime, my clover was thriving. It was now thick and lush, a deep green carpet that required minimal watering and no mowing yet. It looked genuinely nice, and more neighbors were stopping to compliment it and ask questions. I'd become the neighborhood's accidental clover evangelist. The HOA sent another fine notice. $2,000 now for continued violation. I ignored it and forwarded it to Morrison, who sent another letter to the HOA's attorney explaining that their position remained legally dubious. Then something unexpected happened. Kevin, my neighbor with the dented mailbox, tilled up his Parkway and planted clover too. Then another neighbor, a woman named Sarah who lived across the street, did the same thing. Within 2 weeks, 7 houses on Sagaro Drive had torn out their grass parkways and planted clover. Patricia went ballistic. She sent fine notices to everyone. She posted on the neighborhood Facebook page about vandals destroying community standards. She sent emails threatening legal action against multiple homeowners, but something had shifted. People were tired of being pushed around. The rebellion was spreading, and it wasn't just about Clover anymore. It was about an HOA board that had accumulated too much power and become disconnected from the people it was supposed to serve. Our organizing group met at Frank and Linda's house on a Saturday afternoon. 10 people showed up, including several homeowners I hadn't met before. We sat in their living room drinking iced tea and discussing strategy. The biggest problem is getting people to actually vote, Frank said. Last election, only 43 homeowners out of 212 submitted ballots. The board's supporters can easily win with numbers like that. We need to get the word out, Margaret said. Let people know there are alternatives. We need candidates first, Linda pointed out. Good ones who will actually represent homeowners instead of just enforcing rules. After 2 hours of discussion, we had a plan. Margaret, Frank, and a guy named Richard Paulson who worked in finance would run for the 3 open board seats. We'd create a website and social media presence independent of the HOA's official channels. We'd go door to door, host informal gatherings, and make sure every homeowner knew there was an election coming and that change was possible. I volunteered to build the website since I had the technical skills. Within a week, Meadowbrook Homeowners.org was live, featuring information about the candidates, the issues, and how to vote. We carefully avoided saying anything that could be construed as libelous, but we did outline concerns about transparency, financial decisions, and heavy-handed enforcement of petty rules. The current board noticed. Patricia sent a cease and desist letter claiming we were using the neighborhood name without authorization and spreading false information. We ignored it after Morrison confirmed that we had every right to organize and discuss community issues. Meanwhile, the Clover situation was escalating. The HOA board, perhaps recognizing that they couldn't actually win the legal fight over my Parkway, tried a different tactic. They passed an emergency amendment to the landscaping rules specifically prohibiting Clover on any visible property. The amendment notice arrived in everyone's mailbox with a smug cover letter from Patricia explaining that the board had acted to protect property values and neighborhood aesthetics. All existing Clover needed to be removed within 30 days or face fines of up to $5,000. This was the kind of overreach that would prove to be their downfall. I immediately contacted Morrison. Can they do this? Just ban a specific plant that's already growing. It's questionable, he said. Emergency amendments are supposed to be for genuine emergencies, not retaliation against homeowners in a dispute. Plus, Arizona HOA law requires reasonable notice before rule changes take effect. This is 30 days, which might not be enough for something that requires significant work to remedy. And there's the question of whether banning a common landscape plant is reasonable in the first place. What should I do? Keep the Clover. Let them fine you. If they try to collect, we'll argue that the amendment was invalid. Alternatively, if enough homeowners are affected, you could petition for a special meeting to overturn the amendment. The petition option was interesting. According to the CC and Articus, 20% of homeowners could request a special meeting to vote on board decisions. With 212 homes in the community, we'd need 43 signatures. I printed petition forms and started going door to door. So did Frank, Linda, Margaret, and the others in our organizing group. We explained what the board was doing, how it affected property rights, and why it mattered even for people who didn't have Clover. The response surprised me. People were angry. Even homeowners who thought the Clover looked weird were upset that the board would pass rules specifically targeting residents who'd done nothing wrong. The perception that this was retaliation made people uncomfortable. Within a week, we had 67 signatures. We submitted the petition formally, with all signatures notarized as required. The board had to schedule a special meeting within 30 days. They scheduled it for 6 weeks out, on a Friday evening, apparently hoping people would be less likely to attend. It backfired. The Friday evening time meant working people could actually come. When the day arrived, the small clubhouse was packed. Over 100 homeowners showed up, filling every seat and lining the walls. The fire marshal probably would have shut it down if he'd been there. Patricia looked nervous as she called the meeting to order. The other board members, Robert Childers, a woman named Barbara Weatherly, a younger guy named Jason Hunt, and an older man named Donald Pierce, looked equally uncomfortable. "We're here to consider a petition to overturn the board's emergency amendment prohibiting clover as a landscape plant," Patricia said, her voice tight. "The board would like to explain why this amendment was necessary." Robert stood up. "Clover is not a traditional landscape choice in our community. It represents a departure from established standards and could negatively impact property values. The board has a responsibility to maintain aesthetic consistency." "Aesthetic consistency," a man in the back shouted. "You mean control." The room erupted in conversation. Patricia banged a gavel, actually had a gavel, and called for order. "There will be time for discussion," she said, "but we need to proceed in an orderly fashion." Frank stood up. "I'd like to understand the legal basis for the emergency amendment." What was the emergency? The rapid spread of clover plantings threatened neighborhood standards, Barbara said. She was a thin woman in her 60s with glasses and a prim demeanor. "So residents making independent choices about their own property is an emergency," Frank pressed. "That's not what emergency amendments are for. The board has broad discretion to protect community interests," Jason said. He was probably in his 40s, worked in real estate, and usually deferred to Patricia on everything. Linda stood up. "Can someone explain why clover is bad?" "It's green, it's neat, it uses less water than grass. What's the actual problem?" "It's not traditional," Patricia said. "Not traditional isn't a standard," I said, standing up. "The CC and Articus don't say landscaping must be traditional. They say it must be neat, maintained, and appropriate for a residential community. Clover meets all those criteria." "It brings bays," Patricia said, grasping for objections. "So do the flowers you tried to force us to plant," Kevin said. He was sitting near the front and getting visibly angry. "This whole thing is ridiculous. You made a mistake trying to force those flower beds on people. Instead of admitting it and backing down, you're doubling down and trying to punish people who stood up to you." The room erupted in agreement. People were shouting support, sharing their own stories of what they saw as HOA overreach. Patricia lost control of the meeting entirely. It took 10 minutes to restore order. Finally, we got to the vote. The petition called for overturning the clover ban. The vote was by secret ballot, with paper forms distributed to all homeowners present. Homeowners who couldn't attend had been allowed to submit proxy votes in advance. The board members counted the ballots at the front of the room while everyone waited. The tension was palpable. This was about more than clover. It was a referendum on how the board operated. Patricia finally stood up, her face pale. "The vote is 112 in favor of overturning the amendment, 23 against, with 8 abstentions. The amendment is overturned." The room burst into applause. Patricia sat down heavily, looking stunned. This was probably the first time in years that homeowners had directly challenged the board and won. But we weren't done. Frank stood up again. "I'd like to make a motion that the board rescind all fines related to the clover installations, since they were issued for something that's not actually a violation." "The fines were issued for destroying HOA improvements," Patricia said weakly. "Improvements that were installed without permission on private property," I countered. "If you want to debate that in court, my attorney is ready. But I think everyone here understands that the board overstepped, and the right thing to do is drop this and move on." Donald Pierce spoke for the first time. He was a quiet man who rarely said much at meetings. "I think Thomas is right. This has gone too far. We made a mistake with the flower beds. Let's admit it and rescind the fines." Barbara nodded. "I agree. This is hurting the community." Patricia looked betrayed, but she was outvoted. The board voted 3-2 to rescind all fines related to the Clover situation. Jason and Patricia voted against, but it didn't matter. The meeting ended with homeowners lingering in small groups, talking excitedly. Several people thanked me for standing up to the board. Others talked about the upcoming election and how important it was to make changes. Patricia left quickly, getting into her Mercedes and driving away without speaking to anyone. Over the next few weeks, the campaign for the board elections intensified. Our candidates went door to door, attended community events, and used social media to reach homeowners. We focused on transparency, reasonable enforcement of rules, and giving homeowners more say in decisions. The existing board fought back, using their control of official communication channels to promote their slate of candidates. They sent newsletters highlighting all the good things the HOA had done, conveniently ignoring the controversies. They posted on the official website about the importance of experience and continuity in leadership, but something had shifted in the neighborhood. People were paying attention now. They'd seen that organized homeowners could push back against the board and win. They wanted change. Election day arrived in November. Ballots were mailed to all homeowners with instructions to return them by 5 p.m. on the 15th. That evening, the votes were counted at the clubhouse with observers from both sides watching carefully. I was there along with Frank, Linda, Margaret, and about 30 other concerned homeowners. The current board members were there too, though Patricia looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. The vote counting took 2 hours because of the careful verification process. Finally, the results were announced. Margaret had won her seat by a margin of 87-56. Frank had won his by 91-52. Richard Paulson had narrowly won the third seat, 82-79. We'd done it. The board now had 3 new members who actually represented homeowner interests. Patricia was still president until the next full board election, but she no longer had a majority. The immediate changes were subtle but important. The new board members pushed for meetings at times when working people could attend. They created an actual transparent budget process. They established a rule that any expenditure over $1,000 required homeowner notification in advance. They changed the fine system to include warnings and reasonable escalation rather than immediate punitive measures. Patricia fought them on everything, but she was outvoted consistently. After 3 months of this, she resigned from the board entirely, citing personal reasons. Robert Childers resigned with her. The remaining board appointed reasonable replacements, and for the first time in years, the HOA actually functioned as it was supposed to serve the community, not rule it. The Clover stayed. My Parkway looked great, thick and green and requiring almost no maintenance. Several other homeowners kept their Clover too. Some reinstalled grass, which was fine. The point had never been to force everyone to plant Clover. It was about property rights and reasonable governance. But the story didn't end quite there. 6 months after the election, I received a call from David Morrison, my attorney. "Thomas, I thought you should know that Patricia Hensley is being investigated for financial irregularities during her time as HOA president." "What kind of irregularities?" Apparently, the new board decided to conduct a thorough audit of the HOA finances. They found some concerning discrepancies. Patricia had authorized several payments to contractors for work that was either never done or significantly overcharged. There's about $40,000 that can't be properly accounted for. That's embezzlement, potentially. The board filed a report with the Arizona Attorney General's office. I don't know all the details, but I thought you'd want to know. I thanked him and sat back, processing this information. It made sense in a disturbing way. Patricia's aggressive control of the board, her resistance to transparency, her quick resignation when she lost her majority. She'd been protecting something. 3 weeks later, the story made the local news. Patricia Hensley had been arrested and charged with embezzlement and fraud. The investigation revealed that she'd been siphoning money from the HOA for years through fake invoices and inflated contracts. Her accomplice was Robert Childers, who'd handled the financial approvals. Together, they'd stolen approximately $65,000 from the community over a 5-year period. The neighborhood was shocked. Some people had trusted Patricia completely and felt betrayed. Others, like me and the organizing group, felt vindicated. This was what unchecked power and lack of oversight led to. The legal process moved slowly. Patricia hired an expensive attorney and tried to fight the charges, but the evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showed payments to shell companies she controlled. Contractors testified that they'd been asked to inflate invoices and kick back part of the payment. Robert Childers eventually took a plea deal and testified against Patricia, confirming the entire scheme. 8 months later, Patricia was convicted of embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. She was sentenced to 4 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA. Robert got 2 years and probation. The neighborhood slowly recovered. The new board was scrupulously transparent about finances and decisions. They established proper oversight and controls to prevent future embezzlement. They also, somewhat ironically, voted to allow Clover as an approved landscape option, formally amending the rules to include it. I was at home on a Saturday afternoon, nearly 2 years after this whole saga began, when Frank and Linda stopped by with a 6-pack of craft beer. We sat on my front porch, looking out at the Parkway where this had all started. The clover was still there, thick and beautiful, a small patch of green that had sparked a revolution of sorts. It seemed almost ridiculous that something so simple had led to so much change. "You ever regret it?" Linda asked. "Starting this whole fight," I thought about it. The stress, the legal fees that Morrison had ultimately kept reasonable, the conflict with neighbors, the time spent organizing and campaigning. Then I thought about Patricia and Robert in prison, about a board that now actually served homeowners, about a community that was more engaged and aware. "No," I said. "I don't regret it at all." "Good," Frank said, raising his beer. "Because you're running for board president next election. We already decided." I laughed, but I didn't say no. Maybe there was more work to do. Maybe making sure HOAs operated properly required constant attention from good people willing to push back against bad behavior. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. "Board meeting Tuesday at 7. Are you coming? We're discussing the playground renovation, and I think the cost estimates are too high." I texted back that I'd be there. This was the work of living in a community, staying engaged, making sure the systems worked for everyone. Kevin walked by with his dog and waved. "Hey Thomas, I'm thinking of running for the board next year. Want to grab coffee sometime and talk about it?" "Absolutely," I called back. The sun was setting over Phoenix, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The neighborhood was quiet except for the occasional car and the sound of kids playing somewhere down the street. It was peaceful, orderly, and most importantly, it was a community actually governed by its people, not ruled by petty tyrants. My Clover Parkway, that small act of defiance that had started everything, was just one part of my yard now. Not a symbol or a statement, just a nice piece of landscaping that I'd chosen for myself. And that really was the point all along. The following month brought a pleasant surprise. The Arizona Department of Real Estate, which oversees HOAs, reached out to our community as part of a broader initiative on HOA reform. They'd heard about what happened with Patricia and wanted to feature our neighborhood's turnaround as a case study in effective homeowner organization and oversight. A representative named Jennifer Morales came to interview board members and residents. She was a sharp woman in her 30s who'd worked in HOA oversight for 6 years and had seen countless horror stories of board misconduct. "What happened here is unusual in the best way," she told me during our interview. "Most HOA problems just fester because homeowners feel powerless. You organized, you followed proper procedures, and you changed things legally and permanently. That's rare." "It didn't feel rare," I said. "It felt necessary." That's the attitude more homeowners need. HOAs aren't inherently bad, but they need oversight and engagement just like any other governing body. When residents check out and let a few people accumulate power, bad things happen. Her report eventually became part of a state initiative to improve HOA governance, including requirements for more transparent financial reporting and easier processes for homeowners to challenge board decisions. Our little neighborhood fight over a parkway had contributed to statewide reform. But life moved on. The drama faded into neighborhood history, something people mentioned occasionally but didn't dwell on. The Clover stayed, spread a bit, required almost no maintenance, and continued to look good. A few neighbors eventually switched to Clover themselves, not as rebellion, but because it actually was a better option for the climate. I stayed active in the HOA, attending most meetings and serving on the Architectural Review Committee. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept me connected to what was happening in the community and helped ensure that future boards stayed honest and reasonable. Patricia's house eventually went up for sale. The scandal had destroyed her reputation and her finances. A young couple with 2 kids bought it and immediately set about making it their own, painting the door a cheerful yellow and planting sunflowers in the front yard. They had no idea about the history, and that was probably for the best. I ran into Jason Hunt, the former board member who'd sided with Patricia at the grocery store one day. He looked embarrassed when he saw me but came over anyway. "Thomas, I want to apologize," he said. "I should have questioned things more. I just went along with Patricia because she seemed so sure of everything." "I appreciate that," I said. "But the real lesson is for next time. Question authority, even when it's just HOA authority. Especially then, actually, because people tend not to pay attention." He nodded. "I've been going to meetings again, trying to stay informed. It matters." It does. That brief conversation felt like a small victory. Changing minds, encouraging engagement, these were the real outcomes of the whole Clover rebellion. The next HOA election came around, and I did end up running for board president. Frank was right that the community needed continued good leadership, and enough people asked me to run that I felt obligated to try. The election was competitive but fair. I won with 63% of the vote, which felt good but also daunting. Being president meant real responsibility. My first priority was reviewing all HOA contracts and vendor relationships. The embezzlement scandal had made everyone rightfully paranoid about finances. We renegotiated several contracts, finding better rates and more transparent terms. We saved the community about $15,000 annually while actually improving services. We also revised the landscaping rules entirely, throwing out the old document that was full of arbitrary and sometimes contradictory requirements. The new rules were simple and clear. Keep your property neat and maintained, don't let things become hazards or eyesores, and respect your neighbors. Clover, native plants, xeriscaping, traditional grass, all were allowed as long as they were cared for. The transformation of the HOA wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was gradual, a steady shift toward common sense and community service over petty enforcement and control. Meeting attendance stayed high because people trusted that their voices mattered. Violations were handled with friendly communication before fines. The neighborhood actually felt like a community, but I never forgot where it started. That Tuesday afternoon when I came home to find 3 people digging up my parkway without permission. That moment of decision, accept it or push back. I'd chosen to push back and it had changed everything. Years passed. I served 2 terms as board president before stepping down to let fresh leadership take over. The community was stable, functional, and surprisingly harmonious. Property values increased, not because of flower beds or strict enforcement, but because people genuinely wanted to live in a neighborhood that was well managed and responsive to residents. My Clover Parkway remained, now about 5 years old, thick and established and beautiful. It needed mowing a few times a year and almost no water beyond natural rainfall. Small white flowers bloomed in spring, attracting bees and butterflies. Kids walking to school sometimes picked the flowers, and I never minded. I was out watering my front flowers one evening when a car pulled up and a man got out. He was in his 30s, wore business casual clothes and carried a folder. "Are you Thomas Ferguson?" he asked. "That's me. I'm Brad Morrison. I'm thinking of buying a house 2 streets over." My realtor mentioned this neighborhood had some HOA issues a few years ago, and I wanted to check it out before making an offer. She actually suggested I talk to you specifically. I smiled. The HOA issues got resolved. "What do you want to know?" We talked for 20 minutes. I explained the history, the reforms, how the community functioned now. I was honest about the work it took to keep an HOA accountable, but also about how good it could be when done right. "So the Clover was where it started?" he asked, looking at my parkway. The Clover was the catalyst. But really it was about property rights, governance, and standing up when something isn't right. "Would you recommend living here?" I would. "It's a good community now, but stay engaged. Come to meetings. Pay attention. That's how you keep it good." He bought the house. I saw him at the next HOA meeting, sitting in the back, paying attention. That felt like success. Life continued its normal rhythms. Work, home, community involvement, friendships. The drama of the HOA fight became a story I told occasionally, usually with humor, sometimes with lessons about civic engagement. I never planted grass on that parkway again. The Clover stayed, a permanent reminder that small acts of resistance against unreasonable authority could matter. That individuals had power when they chose to use it. That communities were strongest when people actually participated in governing them. Sometimes late at night, usually after a particularly tedious HOA meeting about landscaping standards or pool regulations, I'd think about Patricia in prison, about Robert's plea deal, about $65,000 stolen from people who trusted them. I'd think about how close the community came to never discovering it, how if I'd just accepted that flower bed and moved on, the embezzlement might have continued for years. The Clover had mattered. Not because it was Clover specifically, but because it was the right place at the right time to draw a line and say no. To force attention onto a board that had operated in shadows for too long. To create the accountability that revealed deeper problems. I told this story to a journalist once for an article about HOA reform in Arizona. She asked me what advice I'd give to other homeowners dealing with problematic HOAs. "Document everything," I said. Know your rights and your CC and Artiques. Get legal advice if you need it. Organize with your neighbors. Attend meetings. Vote in elections. Don't be afraid to push back on unreasonable things. And remember that HOA boards work for you, not the other way around. They're not royalty, they're volunteers who are supposed to serve the community. The article ran with a photo of my Clover Parkway and generated a surprising amount of attention. I got emails from people across the country dealing with their own HOA nightmares, asking for advice, sharing stories. The problems were universal. Boards that forgot they served homeowners, rules that became ends in themselves rather than means to maintain community standards, and the eternal difficulty of getting people engaged enough to create change. I answered what emails I could, always with the same basic advice. Know your rights, organize, persist. Change was possible but rarely easy. One email stood out. It was from a woman in Florida whose HOA had banned vegetable gardens, calling them unsightly. She'd fought back, organized her neighbors, and eventually changed the rules. "Your Clover story inspired me," she wrote. "It helped me realize this was worth fighting for. That made everything worthwhile. The stress, the conflict, the time and energy, all of it justified if it helped other people stand up for themselves." As I sat on my porch that evening, reading that email, I looked out at the Parkway again. The Clover was thriving as always, resilient and green. Kids were playing basketball in a driveway down the street. A neighbor waved as she walked her dog. The community was alive and healthy, governed reasonably, functioning well. This was what good HOA management looked like. Not flower beds forced on unwilling homeowners. Not petty fines for minor violations. Not embezzlement hidden behind authority. Just people working together to maintain a nice place to live, with respect for individual property rights and collective needs. The sun set slowly over Phoenix, the heat of the day finally breaking into a pleasant evening. I had a cold beer, a comfortable chair, and the satisfaction of knowing I'd made a difference when it mattered. The Clover stayed green in the fading light, and I knew it would still be there tomorrow and the day after, and for years to come. A small patch of plants that had changed everything, not through any magic of their own, but because they'd been worth defending. Because sometimes you had to till under the flower beds someone else planted without permission and choose something better for yourself. That was the lesson. That was the victory. And that was enough.